Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Can I start by just acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So welcome to the New South Wales Bioenergy Summit. It's fantastic to see such a full room, and I know it was actually sold out, which is terrific. So my name is Paul McCartney. I've been involved in Bioenergy Australia for about the last 7 years, and I can tell you I've never seen crowds like this to events turning up over the last 12 months. There's such a momentum. It's really pleasing to see that you, our members, are just providing so much support, and we're feeling like we're making some headway. So that's terrific. I also thank our sponsors, so Deloitte for providing the premises and being our main sponsor for the event. Gemina and the Race for 2030 and Refuelling Solutions for being our session sponsors. Also like to thank all of our speakers who have travelled far and wide to be here today with us and help with the event. And of course, all of our members from Bioenergy Australia. It's been a growing member base over the last couple of years, and honestly, it's through your strength that we'll make a change and we'll get the policies that we need to help really drive the sector forward. I'm opening this simply because Shahana is an apology. She's had to be in Canberra today for an event reflecting on what the US Inflation Reduction Act means for Australia and obviously representing your interest as members in this space. Throughout the day, I encourage you to share your thoughts and learnings online and tag us at BioEnergy Australia or at Bioenergy Australia on LinkedIn. It's a great way to capture what's going on here and spread the news and continue the momentum.
Firstly, welcome to this this event. This is a very important event that's going to showcase a lot of interesting thoughts and findings that people have been working on the last 6 months, and I think will set the tone for what comes next. As Paul mentioned, I'm a partner here at Deloitte, and with my team focus on energy and climate advisory matters. Bioenergy, renewable fuels, renewable gases are some of the most prominent work that we're doing at the moment for a range of very important stakeholders. What I'd also like to quickly comment on is where we see the sector today and how we see things are moving. And I think, reiterating Paul's thoughts, the first Bioenergy Australia conference I spoke at probably 7 or 8 years ago as well, Paul, was in a small room in the ANU with probably around 20 or 30 people in it, the most of which were board members. So it's absolutely fantastic to see this turnout here and the variety of people here. So the importance of bioenergy, and I think this is a concept that we need to all continue to reiterate, that it is as a technology and an opportunity as a transitionary fuel that will help hard to abate sectors and other areas of the economy that don't have other technologies to support their pathway to net zero. So thinking here, the sectors such as chemicals, mining, transport, agriculture are just a few, many of which were quite prominent here in Australia. And also the total opportunity. So if people are familiar with the Bioenergy Roadmap, which was released a year or so ago now, the opportunity to abate up to 10% of Australia's emissions, and that's accessible today. And importantly, bioenergy as a concept is complementary with other decarbonisation technologies and activities. And the narrative around it being a competitor, it needs to be addressed, because I think we're realising now that this is not an easy task that we're all facing, and what we're talking about here today must be part of the answer. So also on the Bioenergy Roadmap, we need to think about the economic benefit. So from an Australian point of view, up to $10 billion of GDP benefit per annum can be derived from unlocking bioenergy opportunities. 26,000 additional jobs that would otherwise not have been created. Regional development. So bioenergy, Australia is obviously a very vast country with industries that don't sit within capital cities. The ability to develop those sectors to support decarbonisation is very important. And ever more important in both the private and public sector is a narrative around energy security. So the majority of our energy at present is subject to certain trade flows. So the ability to decouple that and de-risk that is an important position as well. So things are positive though. Things are going well. We're making good progress. The biomethane project, which I know we've got a couple of speakers on today at Malabar, and again, congratulations to Gemina and Sydney Water and Origin for their roles in unlocking that opportunity, and we need to see more of it. Green power, renewable gas, the New South Wales government is very much a leader in this space, and we'll hear from Sarah later on some of the interesting work that's happening there. ARENA, and I know Martin's got some interesting news to put forward to the audience today. Unlocking SAF. We're finally seeing the government move forward and invest in this sector and give it the importance and prominence it brings. But however, there's still challenges, and again, we must all work together to unlock these. We need to keep continuing the debate around policy. What role does government and industry play? And now, having been both on government and industry side, it's important to say it's a partnership. It's not one or the other. Both parties need to work together. We're very far behind other countries and jurisdictions, such as the US and the EU in particular, where things like renewable fuels have really become quite prominent, and we need to keep up there. And I think an interesting one is corporate businesses. This is actually one that I've seen a lot of progress in, and where we provide a lot of support to people who aren't necessarily linked to direct to project level information. Things like Coalition of SAF Buyers is a big one, and we'll be releasing shortly a guidebook for organisations and corporates that want to support and develop SAF despite it not being their primary industry, and it does make up a big portion of their various scopes of emissions. So we can actually support that, and there are tools that can do that, and bringing those people to the table will help that happen. And this narrative continues even in the building we're in today. One of the primary reasons our organisation took up the lease in this building is because of the embedded carbon within the existing structure. And if those that aren't familiar with it, it was actually remanufactured around the existing core. And I think, and I'll get the statistic wrong, but the benefit is over 25,000 Sydney to Melbourne flights were effectively embedded by reusing that facility. However, where else do we still need to go? And I think where the narrative needs to go now is we need to actually take action and move on from not just the presentations and the talk and the PDF documents, but to actually putting boots in the ground now. We need to actually move forward, and that's all of us, both corporate entities, project developers, financiers, and governments. And if we do that together, we will see success. And the listing of projects that I mentioned before, hopefully when we meet again in 12 months, it'll be double that number again. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. Again, the turnout here has been absolutely fantastic, and we'll obviously have some really interesting discussions today, and hopefully leave with strong momentum around what we want to do next, because we can make a difference, and we will do following today. So I'll conclude there and invite Terry Butler, if I could, to the stage, who's the Chair of Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance of Australia and New Zealand. Thanks, Terry.
Well, thank you so much. It is just wonderful to be here with all of you in beautiful New South Wales overlooking lovely Sydney Harbour. I also want to acknowledge the Gadigal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. A massive thank you, of course, to Paul for welcoming us. Thank you, Paul. Did a terrific job. It's really lovely to be part of an organisation with you at the head. And I know that we've got so many different people across bioenergy who are working so hard, and are really happy that we've got such an effective and influential organisation advocating for the interests, not just of the sector, but for the broader decarbonisation goals that we can get from bioenergy. So thank you so much, Paul. And to Matt, thank you for having us here in beautiful Deloitte. Fascinating to hear about the embedded carbon of the building, and really wonderful to see the work that Deloitte does in relation to biofuels. Here, also in my home state of Queensland, a lot of work from Deloitte on the question of biofuels, and it's wonderful to see the developing expertise and the work that is done with governments and with industry to make sure that there is a promotion of the sector. So thank you, Matt, for the wonderful and warm introduction. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Terry Butler. I'm the chair of the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance of Australia and New Zealand, a position I've had the privilege of holding now for a little while, since February this year, when I joined the organisation at the Avalon Air Show, where the federal government held its industry roundtable in relation to the creation of the Jet Zero Council, something that I will mention to you shortly. Of course, as we all know in this room, development of sustainable aviation fuel industry in Australia will create jobs, will add to GDP, and it's already technology that exists, that is certified for use now as a drop-in fuel, and is available to scale up if we can just get the market settings right and the government settings right. It's widely accepted, as people would be aware, as a drop-in fuel and a replacement for fossil fuels, and there's international certification of SAF for that purpose now, and it's already in use. And so what that means is that we have technology that exists today that can help us to decarbonise aviation, an incredibly important goal over the next 20 to 30 years. And really, it is the only technology that's available for long-haul flights for the foreseeable future, which makes it so critical for us economically, for people-to-people links, for connectivity with the rest of the world. And so it's so critical that we see the development of SAF here in Australia. But we also know, and as Matt just said, we're lagging other countries in relation to biofuels, in relation to SAF particularly. We've already heard a mention of the US Inflation Reduction Act today, and I think it'll get another couple of runs during the course of the conversation. But of course, there's also, and we've also heard about Refuel EU and the work that's been done in the EU. Everyone's aware of the Japanese SAF mandate. And there's plenty of challenges around the world, and because we're lagging, we need to really play a bit of catch-up footy. But there's also opportunities. And for example, you will have heard Heidi Hoff and Christian Bennett argue in their Lowy Institute article recently that we should be really arguing forcefully that the climate critical minerals and clean energy transformation pillar, the new pillar, the third pillar of the US-Australian alliance, should also engage biofuels. And I think that's something that everyone in this room would strongly agree with. So we certainly need to be thinking about the international context, and we need a very strong focus on SAF here at home. It's really wonderful that we have ARENA in the room, and we'll be hearing from them about the $30 million SAF funding stream. And of course, there's also opportunities with the Industrial Transformation Scheme of the Powering the Regions Fund. And of course, the really big fund nationally is the National Reconstruction Fund. And we're all engaging with the government in relation to the National Reconstruction Fund. There's also, I think it's fair to say, a growing acknowledgement of the importance of SAF by the feds. We saw the comments about fuel security in the Defence Strategic Review and the government's response to the establishment of a Fuel Council, a National Fuel Council, and it's important that we engage with the government in relation to the role that SAF can play in relation to fuel security as well as decarbonisation. You'll also be aware that the first meeting of the Jet Zero Council has already been held. That was held on the 15th of August. I was really pleased to be there on behalf of SAFANS, and a number of people in this room were also at that meeting. It was the first meeting of the Jet Zero Council, and I think it's fair to say that the Minister was, I think, probably pleasantly surprised by the appetite for hard work in the room. People were kind of jumping over each other to take ownership and carriage of some of the work plan items. And importantly, SAFANS, together with BP, are leading work on the creation of an ecosystem here in Australia, which implicitly involves the creation of the right policy settings to make sure that we have the development of a SAF sector here in Australia. We're also very interested in the work plan item that goes to ensuring security of feedstock supply here in Australia. So we're working on that. For those of you who are interested in the work that SAFANS is doing in relation to the Jet Zero Council, and I reckon there'd be a few of you, please make sure you say good day to Georgie York, who is here from Bioenergy Australia, I should say, our National Policy Officer. And in fact, if you can have a chat to any of the Bioenergy Australia staff, they're all critically engaged with this really important work. If you are interested in the outcomes of that meeting, you haven't had a look, the communique is available online. And I was really impressed by the collaborative nature of the communique development. You know, everyone really got involved with making sure that it was sending the right signals. Would also be aware of the aviation white paper process. The green paper was released really recently. Submissions are due by the end of November, and there's plenty to say about SAF in that context as well. Now, you will notice that I have quite advisedly worn a maroon jacket today. I am from Brisbane. In the interests of state of origin rivalry, which I think is a very positive force for good, I'd just like to mention, you know, a few of the things that Queensland is doing in relation to SAF, and hopefully New South Welshmen can take some inspiration from that. Of course, Queensland, the home of SAF, Virgin had a SAF, the first SAF delivery at Brisbane Airport Corporation back in 2018. And since then, there's been a lot of interest in SAF. We've got the Palaszczuk government backing in Qantas, Airbus and LanzaJet for supports for the Jet Zero project. I was just talking to someone about that earlier today. Really exciting. The commencement of a feasibility study for a new biorefinery in Queensland. We've got Ampol and ENEOS, who announced in March that they're looking at the feasibility of using Lytton Refinery for biofuels manufacturing. We've got Oceania Biofuels, which is planning to build a commercial aviation fuel biorefinery up in Gladstone. And of course, bioeconomy is one of 6 priorities in the Queensland New Industry Development Strategy released this year and gets a good run in the Queensland Energy and Jobs Plans as well. So please take inspiration from that. But that's enough from me, enough from a Queenslander. Let's see what other speakers we have today. And I'd like to just make very clear that our first speaker is from the New South Wales Government, Sarah Chambers, from the New South Wales Department of Regional Economic Development, who's presenting on sustainable aviation fuel opportunities in regional New South Wales. We'll then hear from Max Temminckhoff from the CSIRO, who will be speaking on the CSIRO and Boeing SAF roadmap, a feedstock analysis and scale-up blueprint for the region. We'll then be hearing from Daniel Dott from Virgin Australia, who will be presenting on SAF, a principles-led approach to policy development. Then we'll be hearing from Martin Gulbis from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA, talking about the SAF funding initiative. And finally, from Peter Lewis from EarthTech, who'll be presenting on the Hunter Pilot Biorefinery. If you have questions, please note them down. We will be taking a Q&A. Thanks very much. Let's make Sarah very welcome.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sydney. As already acknowledged, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I am from New South Wales. I'm from Bundjalung country up in Lismore in northern New South Wales. So let's see what we can do here in New South Wales. We commissioned a piece of work by the Deloitte team and in partnership with UNSW around a sustainable aviation fuel market study and prospectus. This is really a key piece of work for us because, as has already been identified this morning, there's a significant investment opportunity and development opportunity for regional New South Wales here. As you can see with the picture of New South Wales, we have a really significant amount of biogenic feedstock, particularly in the regional New South Wales. This study does focus on the potential for biogenic SAF rather than the eSAF fuel pathway. As you all know, aviation is a significantly hard to decarbonise sector, and therefore we do need to look to alternative solutions. And work by IATA has identified that SAF will contribute 67% of the efforts to decarbonise the sector. So what we see and what we see the opportunity to be is around that rapid adoption of biogenic SAF. And as has already been touched on this morning, there are significant mandates around the world, such as in the UK and Japan, both setting their 10% SAF targets. The work that we have undertaken in partnership with Deloitte and UNSW identifies that approximately 52% of all aviation fuel in Australia under our prudent scenario by 2050 will allow for a market to develop in Australia valued at $11.9 billion and in New South Wales at $4.8 billion. As I mentioned, and others have already mentioned today, there's really a global picture building in terms of demand for SAF and demand for this transition. We mentioned already those targets in the UK and Japan, also production targets in the US in terms of 3 billion tonnes of SAF by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Of course, the US IRA will also have a significant impact on reaching those targets. It's worth mentioning that as we see the technology being fully commercialised, we'll see a really clear pathway as to which technologies are used and I guess a mix of technologies in terms of reaching that total target. So the SAF opportunity here in terms of based on biogenic feedstocks, as I mentioned, we see that as being $11.9 billion in Australia and $4.8 billion in New South Wales. So that presents a significant commercial opportunity for project developers and investors. And I can see some of you in the room today who are doing some of that work to capitalise on that opportunity. So at the Office of Regional Economic Development, we want to support project developers in capitalising on that investment opportunity and capturing those opportunities for regional development in terms of employment, and more than just jobs, I guess. We're talking about high value jobs and lifting people up in terms of highly skilled workforce in New South Wales, particularly in regional New South Wales. So just drilling down into that detail a little bit further in terms of the scenario building that this piece of work did. So we're looking at between 22 to 52% of total aviation fuel being met by SAF by the year 2050. And I guess, again, saying that the project developers who are working in this space are bedding that down in terms of which technologies will be used, whether it's GFT or A2J, and of course things like HEFA as well. And that's really largely dependent on feedstocks available and keeping our feedstocks here in Australia rather than going to offshore markets. So what are some of New South Wales's competitive advantages around attracting SAF to regional and metro, a combination of regional and metro New South Wales locations? Of course, that feedstock availability is a really key piece of that picture. We estimate that we have 22% of Australia's total biogenic feedstock, which can be used for SAF. It can be used for other purposes. Of course, a lot of you are looking at using it for biomethane and biogas. For this purpose of this study, we're thinking about its use towards SAF. And you'll find as I go into the following slides, there are some really key locations around the state for example, in the Riverina-Murray region, the New England Northwest and the Central West. We, of course, also will have the largest level of demand for SAF in the country, having Sydney Airport here and Western Sydney Airport coming online. Western Sydney Airport is projected to handle 10 million passengers annually. So we're talking about a significant demand here in Sydney itself and broader New South Wales. We believe we have really significant R&D capability in New South Wales, particularly at UNSW itself, and also considering the regions at the University of Newcastle, the work of Professor Alan Broadfoot up at the NEAR Institute in Newcastle, and considering that looking to the future, there will be a role for hydrogen in terms of reaching synthetic pathways as well. The R&D capability we have in that space is significant as well. And of course, touching on the fact that we have existing workforce capabilities in regional New South Wales with transferable skill sets for SAF production. So things like scientific and technical services, and perhaps transitioning from some of the industries in those regions, such as mining and current power generation. So just showing you that feedstock map again around where are these feedstocks located. Obviously, the scale shows you from lighter blue to darker blue. So those dark blue regions are where there are high values of feedstocks. And this is data that our colleagues at DPI have carried over and regularly update. I can see Fabiano and Kath in the room, so thank you so much for contributing towards this project as well. So as I was mentioning, you've got those regions like the Riverina-Murray down in the south, the Central West coming closer back to Sydney, and then of course the New England Northwest up in the north. Just drilling down into the LGAs that have those feedstocks, so places in the north like Moree Plains and Walgett and Narrabri, significant feedstocks there that potentially could be refined in that early stage refining and then perhaps fed into across the border into Queensland, and in the south of the state, in terms of in the Riverina, places like Carathol and Bland LGAs, again, feeding into the existing network that potentially you could transfer some of those volumes down to Geelong. And of course, covering the Metro Sydney area, there's a significant amount of feedstock coming from essentially the large population, and MSW feedstock there. So combination of those feedstocks in the right location, perhaps on the periphery of the Sydney metro area, is something that bears investigation as well. Of course, in New South Wales, we have a really significant existing infrastructure which can be utilised in terms of developing SAF projects, whether that be road, rail or port infrastructure. You'd all be aware of the Inland Rail project, which will significantly upgrade the rail infrastructure across a number of years, and those connections into the existing nodes for refinery will play a really significant role in terms of developing projects. And just to touch lightly again, that we in New South Wales Government have a really strong hydrogen hub project already rolling out, particularly focusing on Newcastle and Port Kembla. And I guess piggybacking on those and collaborating with those in terms of the pathway forward for eSAF pathways will be a significant part of the process as well. And just touching on the topic of complementary workforce, as I mentioned, if you look at a region like the Riverina Murray, there are around 20,000 people who have significant transferable skills to a SAF refinery supply chain. And again, drilling down further into the New England Northwest and Central West and looking at science and engineering graduates as well in New South Wales, we have, some of the highest numbers in terms of nationally as well. Just touching on the R&D factor, as I mentioned, the New South Wales Decarbonisation Hub were one of the partners doing this piece of work for us, particularly within the New South Wales Power, Fuel and Hydrogen Network. And then again, mentioning the work that's undertaken at NEAR, for example, and the work of CSIRO, which we'll hear more about this morning. In New South Wales, there are some complementary government policies in terms of enabling the SAF industry. You'd probably be aware of the NZIP program, or the Net Zero Industry and Innovation Investment Plan, which is being run by my colleagues at the Office of Energy and Climate Change. There are some elements of that particular program that can be particularly relevant for SAF projects. I'll touch on them lightly because they're actually currently in development and would need final approval before they go out to be funding programs in the public. But for example, the Low Carbon Product Manufacturing Fund identifies power fuels and clean fuels as one of the areas it's looking to address. So just to let you know that this Sustainable Aviation Fuel Prospectus will be launched in the coming weeks, and it will be essentially a document capturing these topics around what is the competitive advantage for developing a SAF supply chain in New South Wales. That will be published on our website, Invest Regional New South Wales, and please get in touch with me if you'd like to discuss further. Thank you so much, and I'm handing over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to see these types of granular studies done at the state level. I think they're a very important part of the next steps for this industry. Myself, I'm going to zoom out a little bit and look more from the national point of view and give you a bit of an overview of the SAF roadmap that was brought out by CSIRO and Boeing at the start of August. Thank you very much. Just again with some scene settings. So just to reiterate the hard to abate nature of this sector. So since 1990, Australia has tripled its domestic aviation emissions from 1990 through to 2020. From some of our internal transport modelling, we can see that demand for jet fuel will increase by about 75% through to 2050, with a large portion of that attributed to international emissions and fuel demand, which I'll explain a bit later about why that's so important. There are very few options for aviation to decarbonise. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these, so I'll just go through them quickly. So the first one is efficiency gains, which we're seeing already with the adoption of lighter aircraft and more efficient air movements. We're able to reduce the demand of fuel. Second of all is new propulsion technologies. So the uptake of battery electric aircraft, as well as fuel cell electric aircraft will be very helpful in our short to potentially medium haul flights. And then with the addition of hydrogen combustion, perhaps in the later 2040s, 2050s, will help us with that medium haul flights. But that final long-haul flights, which are those international flights, are really going to be difficult to abate with those technologies. Carbon offsets, we're already seeing quite an uptake of these, but the competition for these will increase and the supply of them will also start to get a bit competitive as time goes on. Flight alternatives, we're seeing this as a good option in Europe where there is good road and rail infrastructure available. So places like France have banned internal flights where there is the option of a train ride that is in a reasonable distance. But for Australia, it's quite difficult given how geographically dispersed we are. So that sustainable aviation fuel option really is going to be a big heavy lifter for Australia. There's a range of modelling out there about how much heavy lifting it will do, and that ranges between about 50 to 70% of emissions reductions getting to net zero will be from sustainable aviation fuel. We had a quick look at what the strengths of different states and territories will be when it comes to SAF production, and it largely aligns with agricultural forestry outputs as well as hydrogen economy strategies. So you can see for New South Wales there, power to liquids as well as municipal solid waste and agricultural residues is probably going to be a key feedstock, as touched on by Sarah. A local SAF industry isn't just about decarbonising aviation. It has a range of other ancillary benefits that are worth exploring. So liquid fuel security. Currently import 90% of our liquid fuels from overseas through increasingly risky supply chains, and the ability to produce Australian fuels from Australian feedstocks made by Australians for Australians is a very powerful and valuable attribute to have, and of a special note for departments like Defence. Local decarbonisation, when you are producing sustainable aviation fuel, you're usually producing other liquid fuels and gaseous pieces, so lighter hydrocarbons, which would be really important in decarbonising our LPG industry, as well as renewable diesel for our transport and remote power industries. Regional jobs and development, this has been touched on quite a few times now, but to develop and sustain these supply chains, we're going to need more help in our regions, and to build, operate our biorefineries is going to require some high skills. Waste management, so municipal solid waste currently usually goes to landfill. This is difficult to manage and can be used as a feedstock for SAF, as well as CO2 that's emitted from a range of our hard to abate sectors such as cement and ammonia production. And finally, Asia-Pacific leadership. So a lot of our neighbours in the region have quite limited landmass and limited ability to produce excess renewables and excess feedstocks, which is going to be required for this industry, which really gives us an opportunity to export these fuels and help our neighbours decarbonise. So to understand Australia's potential, we worked with Boeing to look at a range of feedstocks in Australia and to understand how much potential fuel this would be. So we've looked at carbohydrates, a range of waste products, residues, oil seeds, and power to liquids. So our key finding shows that through a combination of feedstocks and technologies, a large and growing portion of Australia's jet fuel demand can be met with local feedstocks, but domestic refining capacity is lagging. So in 2025, we see about 60% of our jet fuel demand being met with biogenic feedstocks, and this ramps up to about 90% by 2050 as the hydrogen economy starts to scale. You notice up there, the dotted line is the projected jet fuel demand. And then down the bottom, we have the planned SAF production that's been announced. So Terry touched on the Oceania Biofuels, Jet Zero, and the Kwinana plant. But you can see that there's still a significant portion of feedstock remaining that's up for grabs for sustainable aviation fuel. Just wanted to touch a little bit on agricultural residues, as this is a big one for New South Wales, and some of the key considerations about how we go unlocking these. So there on the left is some of our modelling about Australia's agricultural residues and potential growth scenarios. And down the bottom there is approximately how much is needed for a small and large scale plant. So a large scale plant is about 300 million litres of jet fuel per year, which is about how much the Royal Australian Air Force uses currently. Some of the challenges we're going to face in liberating this feedstock is its collection and aggregation. These are very light materials and aren't very conducive to transport over long distances. And so we're going to need to find out ways to increase that density of them using a range of different technologies, such as advanced fermentation to convert it to ethanol, or using gasification to turn it into a syngas and some type of intermediate. There is also an issue with crop residue balance. So farmers like to keep a bit of their crop residue on field to return nitrogen and carbon to the soil. And there are a range of studies out there that looks at what that perfect ratio is. And we've assumed about a 30 to 40% of that residues needs to stay on field to maintain a range of economic and sustainability benefits, but the rest of it is up for grabs if it can be collected. Capital costs, if you are using a process like Fischer-Tropsch, the capital costs of converting these are going to be quite great, and these technologies are pretty old at this stage, and it's going to be pretty difficult to drive those costs down with R&D. So looking at more emerging technologies to convert them into jet fuel is going to be important. And finally, changing climate. So as you can see with that lighter blue line there, it's pretty unpredictable how much residues we're going to have, and it's very susceptible to how much rainfall is going to be happening that year. And so we need to look at ways to develop long-term supply certainty. And one way we can do this is through feedstock hubs. So by collecting agricultural residues as well as other residues such as sawmill or municipal solid waste, CSIRO is looking at technologies that can take all of these feedstocks into the one processing centre to produce a sustainable aviation fuel so that you can reduce that supply risk. We've also looked at the costs of a range of feedstocks. So we can see here that no matter the pathway, sustainable aviation fuel does have what we call a green premium compared to conventional jet fuel, and it ranges depending on the feedstock and the pathway that you choose. So the key messages here, which aligns with our feedstock availability, is that it's biogenic feedstocks in the immediate and medium term that are far more economic and have a certain level of I guess, a flaw in terms of how far you can drive them down, because it really does come down to how much you can get your feedstocks for. And, you know, things like vegetable oil and ethanol, there is only so much you can push those costs down. Power to liquids, you can see, comes down quite a lot as we reduce the cost of hydrogen production, as well as the cost of carbon capture, especially direct air capture. For this piece, we did keep conventional jet fuel as a constant. It is notoriously difficult to forecast this price. I think just in the last 10 years, we've gone down to 20 cents a litre, up to $1.80 a litre, which is not to say there's not going to be upwards pressures on that price, such as carbon prices or refiners needing to squeeze every dime they can out of their jet fuel cut as demand for petrol and diesel decreases through electrification. Just wanted to drive home the effect of feedstock price on the sustainable aviation costs. So this is looking at the 2050 numbers, and we've decreased and increased feedstock prices by 25%. And you can see for things like ethanol and hydrogen, as well as vegetable oil, that if the feedstock price does change, especially if it goes out, that really does make getting cost parity quite difficult. But if we can, through a range of R&D efforts or other mechanisms, get that feedstock cost down, we can really get pretty close to cost parity. That's a lot of text, but these are some of our recommendations for the immediate term, which will be touched on by a range of speakers today. So as mentioned earlier, you know, this is going to be a whole of value chain approach. We need government, we need industry, we need research to do some heavy lifting here to make sustainable aviation fuel and its production locally a thing for Australia. So just running through them quickly. First of all, considering policy frameworks that'll help long-term support for the industry. So those areas around the world that are being fast movers here, places like Europe, Japan, and US, it's because of supportive policy frameworks, be it incentives or mandates, something that Australia seriously needs to consider. Encouraging signalling of local demand. Matt talked about pooling demand between customers. This is going to be very important for these first offtakes and where the green premium is a bit higher. Thirdly, educating consumers on the role and benefits of SAF. So it's pretty difficult to go through a European airport at the moment and not see advertising for sustainable aviation fuel. And fourth, investing in research and development, which Martin will touch on in a bit more detail. So CSIRO and ARENA have quite a lot of work to do here. And finally, scaling up biogenic SAF production in the appropriate locations. So as Matt said, it's time to get started. Just a couple of things that CSIRO is working on at the moment. So in terms of power to liquids, we have a pretty good history in hydrogen technology development. So we're pairing that with a range of our direct air capture technologies, as well as point source capture technologies. And one of our labs in Perth, we can combine those two to make longer hydrocarbons. In terms of feedstock production and processing, we've got our agriculture group looking at increasing yields of certain oil seeds, as well as how we collect and process these which is combined with our energy group, which is that project I was talking about earlier, about how can we process a range of feedstocks together to produce a sustainable aviation fuel. We have our Toward Net Zero mission, who is focused on bringing together researchers and industry to solve some of these challenges. And then finally, our group, Cyro Futures, which has produced the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Roadmap. And we're also providing technology advice to the Royal Australian Air Force about how we make their jet fuel more sustainable. That's all I had for you today. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Max, and welcome everybody. It's great to see so many faces here, to be honest. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to you about sustainable aviation fuel and some of the work that Virgin's doing in this space. So my name's Daniel. I'm the head of fuel and aviation decarbonisation. I've been with Virgin for about 2 years now. My role sits actually within the flight operations team, which is a bit unusual, but I work very closely with the pilot group actually in respect of some of the work that they're doing in reducing the fuel that is used. So I'm talking to you a bit about the work that we're doing, but also what I would call a principles-led approach to policy development. Clicker going. So Virgin Australia has a long and deep history in respect of sustainable aviation fuel. I'll just talk about some of the major things that has been worked on. So in 2016, in partnership with Air New Zealand, we launched an RFI to procure about 200 million litres each of sustainable aviation fuel from locally produced SAF. The idea was to create a demand signal. It did. It created a pretty incredible demand signal. There was a lot of interest, recognising that there was a real benefit to de-risking the sector in terms of investment and creating some high-skilled jobs within the region. But despite that very clear interest, I guess the economic and policy environment at the time wasn't really conducive to a large-scale offtake agreement. In 2018-19, as Terry mentioned, we were the first airline to, with the support of the Queensland Government and in collaboration with Gevo and Ampol, to put aviation fuel into the sustainable aviation fuel in the supply chain. We filled more than 700 flights, educated key stakeholders in respect of sustainable aviation fuel. Just recently, in 2023, we received our MAX 8 aircraft. It's a very fuel-efficient aircraft. We loaded a batch of sustainable aviation fuel onto that aircraft, and that was also to mark our partnership with Boeing. A sustainability strategy. Sustainability is the core of what we're doing. And if you look at that sort of top right sector, you'll see climate change. Part of that is to ensure that we are addressing the real threat of climate change by decarbonising our operations to the extent that we can. In terms of our sort of nearer term strategy, fleet renewal represents the biggest opportunity for us. We're targeting a 22% reduction in net emissions intensity from a 2019 baseline by 2030. And the way we're doing that is through replacing a lot of our NG aircraft with 737 MAX aircraft, but also replacing some of our older F100 aircraft over in WA with 737 aircraft. The 738 MAX it's an incredible aircraft actually. What we've seen in the operation is a 15% reduction in fuel efficiency. So fuel making it a much more efficient aircraft than the NG aircraft. Carbon offsets, we've got a commitment to high quality offsets, recognising that the role that they can play as a bridge or as an interim measure. But beyond 2030, sustainable aviation fuel really will be critical for us to be able to achieve our 2050 targets. We've talked about this before, but in terms of how sustainable aviation fuel does that, it's got at least an 80% reduction in life cycle emissions relative to conventional jet fuel. And as Terry mentioned, the Jet Zero Council was established by the federal government to really promote or help identify opportunities in terms of decarbonising aviation, with particular reference to sustainable aviation fuel and other emerging technologies. For Virgin Australia, electric aircraft is probably not going to be a way in which we will enable us to decarbonise, just given the nature of our network, and also hydrogen fuel technology is probably in the longer term. So sustainable aviation fuel really is in the timeline horizon that we're looking at. As I mentioned, partnerships is quite key actually, and I think Max mentioned it. Partnerships is really important in terms of trying to understand how we can promote and also advance the sustainable aviation fuel conversation. It's no one industry participant working by themselves, they're working in partnership. Boeing's and Virgin Australia's MOU is a demonstration of that. Virgin Australia also participates in industry conversations as well as the Jet Zero Council, which we mentioned. In terms of the Boeing MOU, we're looking to address 5 key areas, sustainable aviation fuel being the first one, promoting First Nations supply chains, careers for women in aviation, high quality carbon offsets, and closer US-Australia clean energy cooperation, which is another key one. So as has already been mentioned, SAF represents a really incredible opportunity for airlines to decarbonise, but it's not without challenges, and it's key as from an airline perspective to have the conversation around what those opportunities and challenges look like. Obviously, it has a fairly significant decarbonisation benefit. Flexibility, it can be produced from a range of feedstocks, from a range of technological pathways. It's 100% safe to use. It goes through a really robust process to make it, to endorse it, to ensure that it meets specification. It's 100% safe to use. It's a drop-in replacement. It doesn't require any additional infrastructure. You don't need to change aircraft engines. You don't need to change supply chains. And it's actually one of the key benefits of sustainable aviation fuel versus sort of hydrogen or electric technology. It's available now. It's being produced now. It's being used now. It's there for us to use. It's cleaner burning. Some studies have shown that actually it reduces particulate matter in terms of the tailpipe emissions by over 50%. And some studies have also shown that it can increase fuel efficiency by around 2 to 3%. So there is some fairly significant benefits there. Some of the challenges are that it is economically unviable, absent some strong policy support. Max showed some slides showing the price of SAF in the market today. The cheapest SAF you can get is in the US with fairly strong policy support for around 2 times the cost of conventional jet fuel. And in other markets like Europe, you're talking sort of 4 to 5 times the cost of conventional aviation fuel. Sustainability question marks, and that's actually a really great opportunity for Australia, that our feedstocks have got some really great sustainability credentials around them versus other jurisdictions. The availability of it, there is no commercial SAF production in Australia at the moment. It's produced overseas. A lack of a global certification criteria. There is this food versus fuel conversation. SAF produced in one jurisdiction that meets that jurisdiction's criteria isn't necessarily usable in other jurisdictions. A key one, perhaps, for this conversation is its competition with other transport biofuels such as HVO or biodiesel. That makes, as a producer, an interesting sort of economic challenge or opportunity in respect of the production of biofuels. And sustainability attribute accounting. Now, that's an important one as well, because SAF that's produced doesn't necessarily get used where it's produced. So if it's inserted into a supply chain such as Brisbane Airport or Sydney Airport, the airline that purchases it might not have access to either of those 2 airports, and therefore wants to be able to access the sustainability attributes associated with sustainable aviation fuel. And in sort of a global context, there is this mechanism called book and claim, where SAF that's produced, for example, in the US, used in the US, is decoupled from the physical and the sustainability attribute of that fuel, and consumers can purchase the sustainability attribute despite the fact never putting a physical molecule of jet fuel onto their aircraft. So that's an economically and efficient way of actually getting the benefits of SAF, but there is no globally recognised mechanism to allow for that. Policy support, as we've mentioned, is and we'll hear probably more and more, is quite key actually to unlocking the opportunity that SAF represents. Typically, there are 2 types of policy support. On the supply side, the incentives or the carrot; on the demand side, the mandate or the stick. So you would have heard the US Inflation Reduction Act, and you hear that more and more as well, and the Californian LCFS. So just some of the, I guess, attributes or benefits. They increase SAF production. It really does encourage R&D into new feedstocks and pathways. It supports SAF with the highest life cycle carbon assessment. It closes the price gap between SAF and conventional jet fuel, recognise the circular economy benefits, but there is a cost to government in respect of that typically. On the demand side, there are some examples in Europe with the French blending mandate, the Refuel EU with a 2% currently increasing to 63%. That also increases SAF production, but it tends to only benefit existing feedstock technology pathways. It also encourages the lowest cost of compliance, especially where buyout mechanisms exist. And that's an interesting one where actually the demand, i.e. the mandate on SAF, exceeds what's actually out in the market. And so there are mechanisms that allow suppliers, if the obligation is on the supplier, to buy out of their obligation, which means that consumers are often lumped with a bill for SAF that they never actually got in the end in the first place. It can lead to some market distortion if not applied harmoniously, and it is actually the greatest cost to end users. So going back to the example I provided before, in the US where you've got supply side incentives, the cost of SAF is around 2 times the cost of conventional fuel. On the right hand side where you've got mandates in Europe, it's about 4 to 5 times the cost of sustainable aviation fuel, or conventional fuel. As a policy support, so in terms of what looks good for an Australian sort of policy development, any policy developed must be developed in consideration of reducing investment risk. That's an important one. You don't want policy changes to create project risk. It must increase or maintain end user confidence and meet all of government decarbonisation and energy security objectives. And using the following consideration of principles, must be supported by robust environmental and economic analysis and derived through all of industry and government collaboration. A Jet Zero Council is a really good example of that. Receive bipartisan support, ensures economically fair and equitable for all users of SAF, ensures efficient and economic access to sustainability attributes. So going back to that book and claim or the decoupling physical supply with the sustainability attribute, meets Australia's national security or other relevant interests, leans into broader international sustainability criteria through a uniquely Australian lens. Some of the concerns raised in international jurisdictions just don't apply in the Australian context because we already naturally have a very high standard in respect of that. Considers the need for investment in training and skills development and considers cross-border international opportunities. I think that's all I've got for the moment. Thank you. I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Firstly, I just want to say thank you to the previous speakers that we've had today, really setting the scene for what I'm about to talk to you right now. My name's Martin Gulbis. I'm a senior investment analyst at ARENA, and today I'll be talking about ARENA's Sustainable Aviation Fuel Funding Initiative. We launched this on the 3rd of July this year, and we've got expressions of interest open at the moment until the 1st of November. We're really seeing great interest from the sector in this initiative, which is really positive to see. And today I'll be giving you a bit of an overview of our context of how we came to structuring this funding initiative, as well as key findings from our consultation, as well as a bit of a background on the initiative itself. Before I get into it, just want to firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands of which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So firstly, who is ARENA and what do we do? So we're the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and we've been around for 10 years now, and our goal is to support the transition to net zero emissions. And we do that by using grant funding to provide funding support for pre-commercial innovation and renewable energy technologies. So our goal is really to use grant funding to try and support some of the technologies that are out there that are pre-commercial, where there's investment gaps, where there's risks. This is a goal to really try and bring in private investment into this space. Just a bit of context of where ARENA's invested its funding to date. So over 10 years, we've invested over $2.25 billion, and that's leveraged over $3.32 of private investment for each dollar of grant funding invested. And so that's at a total project cost of $9.75 billion and over 663 renewable energy projects. There's a range of sectors where we've provided funding in the past, with bioenergy receiving over $131 million throughout the history. With the SAF initiative, we'll be using this $30 million to make impact in the sector and really bring in private investment into this space. So there's a wide range of pathways to assist the decarbonisation of the aviation sector. Each of them have a very important part to play. And to be honest, we're starting mostly at a standing start, and that's where we need development across all these sectors. I'll focus specifically on sustainable aviation fuel, where the market typically agrees that SAF will produce over 45% of the sector's decarbonisation by 2050. And there are two potential pathways here. So there's a biofuels, a biogenic pathway, or power to liquids and e-fuels. I showed this modelling from McKinsey because it shows an interesting forecast of what the future might look like and the role of certain technology pathways out to 2050. Again, this is a forecast. This is looking to the future, which, as we all know, is uncertain. But I point this out because when we're looking at how we can create impact with this $30 million of funding with SAF, we're looking at how can we get to producing SAF in the short to medium term. So if we look at the prudent scenario here, we've got biofuels contributing over 81% of the SAF production by that point in 2030, with power to liquids only contributing 19%. And in the optimistic renewable energy scenario, we see biofuels contributing 69% of SAF emission reduction, with power to liquids with the balance. And I point this out because we believe by supporting biogenic production pathways of SAF, we can really create some impact in the short to medium term. And that's not to say that power to liquids don't have an important role to play. They certainly do. We just see that impact really increasing following, following 2040 and onwards. And we really see that the cost reduction pathway is really down to reducing costs of hydrogen, reducing costs of direct air capture. And really, we see that, power to liquids does have an important role to play, but in the future. Another interesting insight I want to bring from this graph here is, I guess, the forecast on HEFA production pathways. And while an important role today in producing SAF, and the only form of SAF typically out there today, we don't see a large increase of HEFA production over the out to 2050, only contributing between 3 to 5% of emissions reduction in this modelling. And I think that sort of points out where really we need to look at those production pathways that can really create impact out to 2050. And that's where we're focusing on the biogenic SAF production. To now thank you all for many of you that are here today that provided input to our design and consultation process. You really helped us inform us and really focus how we should structure this funding initiative. So thanks all for your insights. To just really draw on some of the key themes that came out from these discussions. So clearly Australia has a great feedstock advantage. And what we really need to do is onshore production of biofuels rather than the status quo of exporting these feedstock for others to take advantage. We're seeing a lot of international and domestic developers that really see Australia as a key location for SAF production facilities, and that's a really positive sign to see. We also spoke a lot about the capabilities of Australia's existing refinery infrastructure and how important they are to really onshore production of SAF and ensure that products and any produced SAF actually remains onshore. We also spoke a lot about sustainability in SAF and that not all feedstocks are created equal. And it was quite interesting to see that there were contrasting views within industry, which then again changes again for the general public. And that, with the general public, they won't have the same nuanced views on sustainability and how SAF isn't greenwashing. And I think that's where it's really important that we need to be very clear on our messaging on food versus fuel, land issues, and really build social license. And we really need to look to frameworks that have been established globally to look at how sustainability is considered and how you assess the various production pathways that exist for SAF. Also, we're seeing a lot of momentum in this space, a lot of interest in SAF, but the industry is very much at an early stage of development. And that's where there was a big call from industry for further development capital support to really move some of these early stage projects towards FID. And just to highlight some of the announcements that have been there recently in this sector, there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of interest, a lot of buzz, and I think that's where it's a really good time where we've got this funding initiative open. So the Bioenergy Roadmap, so released in November 2021, but this really highlighted aviation as a hard to decarbonise sector where bioenergy resources have a competitive advantage. We're seeing a lot of announcements over the last year. We've got Qantas and Airbus with their SAF fund, BP and Ampol with their biorefinery ambitions, Virgin in Australia and Boeing with their recent MOU, and Rex investing in Dovetail and electric propulsion is really great to see. We've got industry and government working together with the Jet Zero Council. We've got our ARENA's $30 million funding initiative where we can hopefully start to seed some investment in this space and get closer towards SAF production. We've got CSIRO and Boeing SAF roadmaps, a brilliant piece of work, and congrats, Max, to you and the team for putting this out there at a really opportune time to collate the industry's views, to show what the key challenges are and create a template for how we should consider sustainability of various feedstocks. And finally, onto ARENA's SAF initiative. So what are we trying to do here? We're trying to support SAF production from renewable feedstocks in Australia. And some of our key objectives here are to support technology commercialisation. So that's where we really want to leverage the positive work and development that's occurred domestically and internationally on SAF production pathways and really move them towards commercialisation in Australia where possible. We also want to understand what developments are required across the sector and supply chain, all the way from feedstock aggregation, perhaps logistical approaches to enable SAF production. And we also want to understand the investment requirements. So not just at this early stage, but what's the actual capital needed to actually get to SAF deployment. And these are some of the key things that we want from this initiative. And in terms of what sort of scope of projects are we looking under this? Well, really, as long as it meets our funding announcement guidelines, really we want to leave it to the industry to tell us where we should be investing money in this space. So really we want industry to come to us and tell us what they think is required. And just a few final things. So the funding initiative is open now. It closes on the 1st of November. If you haven't reached out to us already, please do by contacting us at saf@arena.gov.au. During this early phase, during the EOI phase, we are able to provide high-level guidance to people seeking to provide proposals. So if you are interested, reach out to us via email, send us a 10-slide overview of your project, and we're happy to provide feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate this is the last talk before coffee time, so try not to take too long. So I'm going to be, I guess, stepping back a bit, talking about the actual production of some biofuels. And this is work which we're doing up at the Hunter Pilot Biorefinery. And I'd like to thank the organisers as well for the invite and Deloitte for providing this adequate space. Thank you very much. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so the Hunter Pilot Biorefinery. So this is an R&D facility. It's located up near Muswellbrook in New South Wales, which is in one of those renewable economic zones. Muswellbrook's a great site. It's got excellent infrastructure because of the mining and power generation industries. And it's also an area where the local community is embracing and engaging in the transition from mining and power generation into new opportunities. So the purpose of the work we're doing at the pilot plant is to optimize production of second generation ethanol, which I'll talk about in a little bit, platform chemicals and high value fermentation products. So really in this talk, I'm just going to focus on the actual bioethanol. I won't talk about the other aspects of the project that we're doing. So second generation ethanol and the EthTech process. So we've had a few comments that about the actual availability of feedstocks. So second generation ethanol is ethanol that's produced through the fermentation of sugars following hydrolysis of material in plant stalks and so on. So it's organic residues. It's not the actual crop that is used for food. So we don't compete with land for food production. So we're taking the waste, the residue from the actual food production and using that to actually make our biofuel. The EthTech process is feedstock agnostic. So basically, so long as it's roughly woody, so long as it's roughly strawy, so long as it's got some carbohydrate in there, we can use it. Just so long as it's not wet and moldy, we can handle it. Okay, so we can take agricultural residue, straw, sugarcane bagasse, cotton gin waste, nut shells, things like that, forestry residue, municipal green waste. So we're very flexible. So just going back to second gen 101. So stalks, woody stalks, they comprise of lignin, cellulose and hemicellulose. Cellulose and hemicellulose are sugar polymers. So what we want to do is get those sugars out of that stalk. And most technologies use some sort of pre-treatment to separate away the lignin to allow access to the cellulose and hemicellulose. And then enzymes can be used to hydrolyze the chains of cellulose and hemicellulose into the sugar monomers, which can then be fermented. The problem with that is that it requires specific enzymes for each feedstock. So you need to optimize your conditions for each particular feedstock you're using because the structure of those sugar polymers is going to be different, and you can only use your enzymes once. They're not recyclable. So the EthTech process doesn't require any enzymes to release the sugars, which is why we're feedstock agnostic, and we can recycle the compounds which we use to generate those sugar monomers. So we're not having to constantly remake a new batch of enzymes. So we've got one process for any feedstock. So if we drill down a little bit, sorry about the biology, but biology is very cool. Okay. So polymers of lignocellulose. So we've got cellulose, and cellulose is a polymer of D-glucose. And that's great. D-glucose is a 6-carbon sugar, and they are really easily fermented. That's fantastic. That's very easy. Humans worked that one out a very, very, very long time ago. Drink to that. So hemicellulose, though, is slightly more complex, okay? And that is made up of monosaccharides of 6 and 5 carbon sugars. So as we've said, the 6 carbon sugars, they're great. 5 carbon sugars are a little bit more tricky. And that's where the devil in the detail lies in these processes. To really maximize the yields, we need to be able to utilize all the available sugars. So the C5 and the C6 sugars. Okay, and that's why second gen ethanol has been slightly more slow to get going because of this need to really maximize the use of every sugar available. So the actual plant, there it is. This should hopefully be something that's good for Matt to see and Sarah as well, because ARENA and the New South Wales state government have been really important in actually getting this project up and going. So we've got over 3,000 square metres of floor space on a 3.5 hectare block. We've got a biomass stockpiling storage area. We also collect our water off that roof as well, so we're not drawing water from the council area. Got a general purpose biomass handling and processing area. That's where we convert our organic residues into the sugar solutions, which then go into our PC2 fermentation facilities. So for those of you who don't know, PC2 is a legislative instrument by the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator. And basically, it's a license which allows us to use genetically modified organisms within that space, so long as they don't get out. And that's very much the detail, the desire. So we have capacity in the large-scale lab for fermentation of up to 20,000 litres. So it is pilot scale. Okay. And then we've also got offices, conference and teaching workspaces. Because this is, as I said, it's an R&D facility, and we also have close links with the University of Newcastle through this project. So commercial scale production. So that is penciled in for the first plants to be constructed around 2027. The initial sites will be in North Queensland. The reason for that is that many of the STEC shareholders are sugarcane farmers and significant investors in the project. And through them, we have access to, in the North Queensland area, around 6 million dry tonnes of bagasse. And that gives us a potential nameplate production capacity of around 1.2 billion litres per year of ethanol. Okay, so it doesn't cover all our requirements, but it's not a bad start, theoretically. So just focusing back on the biofuels. So we've got our glucose and xylose. We've worked everything out, and we're converting all of our glucose and xylose into ethanol. So ethanol is currently blended with petrol. We can blend it with diesel. But the purpose of this particular talk is the conversion of the alcohol to jet by the process ATJ to produce sustainable aviation fuels. So again, the devil's in the detail. There are ways in which you can do that. They all, nearly all but one that I've read about requires an external source of hydrogen. And if you're going to use hydrogen, how you're going to make that hydrogen, how you're going to do that sustainably, and how you're going to do that sustainably without using up the feedstocks which we're using to make ethanol. Got some ideas, but that is an issue. But there are technologies. There's one technology where you can even use wet ethanol, as it were, so it doesn't have to be dried. And you can use quite low concentration ethanol to produce the sustainable aviation fuel. I think that's quite an exciting area where you're using doped zeolites to do that, but it does require some finessing, and I believe LanzaJet are involved in that project. So an alternative as well to using ethanol, which we're looking at as well, this is very, very much at the beginning stage, is that there are also some other organisms that instead of converting the sugars into ethanol, can convert it into fatty acids, which are longer chain, so they're closer to the actual length of carbon molecule that you need for sustainable aviation fuel. And using the process of catalytic hydrothermolysis, you can convert these fatty acids into sustainable aviation fuel. As I said, that's very much at the idea stage. We're just beginning to get that going, but that shows some potential promise as well. So thank you very much for your time, and I believe that we're all going to be quizzed now.
Absolutely. We do have some time for questions before morning tea, only a handful. So let's hear your trickiest, curliest, most complicated questions for our panel. Not me, though. Not me, to be clear. Let's see, what have we got? And when you get the microphone, please do make sure to introduce yourself. Everyone's been terrified into a stunned submission. All right, well, I've got one. Could the panel just talk to us a little bit more about what do we think we can do to overcome some of those barriers that we've heard about today? For example, Daniel, you talked about the price issue. We know that we've got competition internationally in terms of markets for feedstocks. If we could only do one thing, what would it be?
Can you hear me? I think it's taking an all of government industry approach. I think it's coming together through a body like the Jet Zero Council, recognising the broader economic opportunity that SAF represents, but also the other significant benefits around liquid fuel security. And that'd be one of the key ways to address the quite significant green premium associated with SAF.
Max, the CSIRO and Boeing report had some really great short-term measures. We want to talk to us a little bit about what can be done first and what's the most urgent and pressing.
Well, yeah, it wouldn't double up on what Daniel said, but I think in terms of other pieces, I'll probably, as a representative from CSIRO, drive home the importance of research and development. So we've heard some really great chats about advanced fermentation. I think that's going to be a really important piece to solidify a long-term and sustainable ethanol source. But I think as well, touching on power to liquids, I know a lot of the conversation has focused on biogenic, and that is a really great source for today, and it will be in the future. But I think power to liquids is going to be a major contributor. We have a feedstock that is almost infinite in water and CO2, which can be sustainably turned into a fuel that's almost a net zero fuel. And I think that we have to start seeding those investments today and start scaling up that process, because that'll really be the big contributor through to 2050.
All right. Sarah, you're from regional New South Wales. I'm a regional Queenslander myself. Tell us a little bit more for people who are interested in investing in the regions and scaling up production in the regions. What's the best way to engage with the New South Wales government?
Sure. If there are projects in the pipeline for you all in a regional location, then please reach out to me. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, I'm from the Regional Economic Development. We have a sister agency who's focusing on metro everywhere. Sydney, effectively, Greater Sydney, Investment New South Wales. So I have a colleague who can take care of those projects. But for both of us, we are essentially a one-stop shop for investors to come and speak to government. We'll find you, if you need support around planning pathways or EPA or any of those other agencies, that's our role to help you find that support. Also, potentially to find, funding support or expertise within government. So.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I know we've got a lot of appetite for engagement in the room today, and I gather we've got a question. Thank you. Terrific question. Who wants to take that one? Thanks, Martin.
I guess opportunity for me to speak on that. Look, I think our approach, with our funding is to really find who could be some of those key contributors to develop SAF projects. And I think one of the big things we're really focusing on there is, good consortiums that can deliver projects. As good EPCs out there in Australia that do have experience in developing technical projects. Sure, there's a lot of expertise internationally, more oil refining expertise, but we really think there is an opportunity in Australia to leverage some of the capabilities that exist. And really with, $30 million of funding that we have, we know this isn't going to break the back for the industry, but hopefully it sort of provides a good signal to investors that, Australia is really considering, what projects we could invest in here and how we can start, getting towards production of SAF locally.
Thank you, Martin. We've got a question at the back.
Hi everyone, Manuel from New South Wales Government as well. Hi Sarah. Thanks for the excellent presentations. I'd like to hear a bit more about the feedstock security and feedstock supply point. We saw it in a couple of your presentations how crucial the bringing to aggregation of feedstock is for to have a bit more certainty for projects. Maybe to the developers and private industry people, like what exactly is the role that you think you can play as private industry, and where's the need for government support? And maybe from Sarah as well, where do you see regional New South Wales playing a role in that space?
Great question. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think in some aspects, some of that aggregation of feedstock is relatively straightforward. So our initial commercial scale plant is earmarked for North Queensland. So the sugarcane is taken to the plant for pressing in the first place. So you have already access to your material. It's already there. Places like cotton gin trash as well is something that we're looking at. So again, that's material that's already been taken to a site. And I think municipal green waste is another really big opportunity, especially in large metropolitan areas where there are collection points already. So you can, as it were, piggyback on the side of that. Forestry is more complex, and we've just had a report commissioned where we've actually looked at that. But there's certainly opportunities with things like that. Then it could well come down to policy to actually drive the economics of the process to make it something that's worthwhile for people within the forestry industry, not just to leave everything, but to actually, there's value in using some of that residue.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah.
Just a follow-up comment in terms of the role for government, as Peter's identifying some of those feedstock streams. I guess there's a higher degree of difficulty of aggregating it, and it's currently being used for, I guess, for other purposes to some degree, particularly in terms of the agricultural crop residue. So as I think Max touched on in his presentation, in terms of leaving it in the field, using it to replenish nutrients. But as Max identified, there is, I guess, some studies out there saying that the return or the benefit from that actually depletes as you reach a certain threshold. So I guess through conversations, perhaps with our colleagues in DPI and other organisations, we need to have that conversation with landholders and talk about it from the point of view of an investment opportunity in terms of providing that feedstock to this market. And I see that as a piece of work that we need to do going forward.
Thanks, Sarah. I've got another question. Thank you.
Hi, this is Tats from Sojitz. So it's not a question, just more for the confirmation for Sarah. So of course, the feedstock availability is absolutely important for our biogenic stuff. And then I think the federal level and I think the Queensland government had kind of website that we can trace like a feedstock availability in the region. And then in your slide, I think third and fourth one, you show the New South Wales, feedstock availability. Is there any particular website I can check for those information? Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. So a lot of that data is available on the AREMI website or the ABBA database, which was originally funded by ARENA. I can share the information in terms of links and specific information for you, and is updated in each state by a state-based entity. In New South Wales, it's GPI who does that. That's particularly for things like agricultural feedstocks, forestry residues, and then you can look at other sources like the EPA for municipal solid waste. But I can share with you the data that we used to build the model that you've seen on screen today, which is an aggregation of all of those different sources. So it's trying to make things easier for people to access that data.
Thanks so much, everyone. That's time. Great session. Thank you to our panelists. Let's give them a massive round of applause. They're up first and they've really knocked it out of the park. Thanks, everyone.